Hey guys, it's Nick, and welcome to episode 6 of Whiteboard Wednesday. We're approaching the end of our series on how to underwrite a rental property deal. Last week we talked about cash flow, and specifically how much cash flow you should be looking for from a rental property investment. But today we're going to talk about kind of the difference between the cash flow that you're getting and the amount of money that you invested. So if you invest $20,000 in a deal and you're getting $200 a month cash flow, or if you invest $60,000 in a deal and you're getting $250 a month cash flow, like you can see that although you're getting more cash flow in the second deal, it's not as good of an investment because you had to invest 3 times as much money just to get a little bit more cash flow. So how do you quantify that? It's using this equation that we'll talk about today, which is your cash on cash return on investment. And then we'll also talk about how to take two different deals, maybe different price points, different amount of renovations needed, and determine which one would be a better investment based on this equation. So the equation, again, your cash on cash return on investment, what you're looking at is the amount of cash flow that you're getting for every dollar that you invested. So the top part of the equation, we talked last week about how to determine how much cash flow. Again, you can go back and watch all of the previous parts of the series about how to determine your income, your expenses, your reserves, and ultimately your cash flow. But you would take that monthly cash flow number, multiply it by 12, and that gives you your annual cash flow. The bottom part of the equation is the total amount invested. So that would be the total amount of money that you paid out of your pocket towards the deal. This is any money that you spent that now you do not have the ability to invest elsewhere. So for example, let's say you buy a $100,000 house, you put 20% down. So you put $20,000 of your own money into that investment. Let's say you spent $2,000 in closing costs. Now you're at $22,000. Maybe you spent $8,000 to renovate it. So now you're at $30,000. And then maybe $2,000 in carrying costs. So while you were renovating it, you were paying the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, the utilities. So that's all money coming out of your pocket going into this property. That's all your money invested. So let's say now you're $32,000 in to your investment. Let's say it's cash flowing $333 a month. So times 12, that would be $4,000 a year. So 4,000 over 32,000, that would be 12.5% cash on cash return. So a couple things that I want to point out about that number. So some people might look at that and say 12% cash on cash return. I could probably average about 10% in the stock market. Why would I go through all of this to make only a slightly higher return than the stock market? It's so much work. Stock market, you just click a button on your computer and you're done. So a couple of things that I would say to that. The first thing is that we are only talking about cash flow here. Cash flow is certainly not the only way that you make money in real estate. So you might be getting a 12.5% cash on cash return, but maybe you're averaging 3 to 4% appreciation in the market. Maybe your loan pay down is another 3 to 4%. Maybe you're getting tax benefits that equate to a couple percent. So maybe at the end of the day, when we look at your internal rate of return or a more holistic picture of your return on investment, it might be closer to 20%, even though the cash on cash return is only 12% of that process or of that amount. So that's one thing that I'm going to point out is that you're only looking at a small piece of your overall ROI here. The other thing that I'm going to point out is you're looking at really year one. So the amount of cash flow that you're getting the day you close on the property, and that number is expected to go up over time. So think about how much rents were 10 years ago. In a lot of parts of the country, rents have doubled in the last 10 years. So if your mortgage payment is fixed, but rents are continuing to go up, your monthly cash flow will be going up over time. So you may look at a 10% return on investment and say it's going to take 10 years to get all of my investment back. But in reality, it won't because your cash flow should go up over time. One thing that I would caution you on, though, is although your return on investment will go up over time because most of your money invested is going to be in the beginning, hopefully your capital expenditures, your maintenance, and all that are coming out of your reserves. So you don't have to put a ton of your money after that initial phase into the investment. Your equity in that property is going to grow over time. So you may look 10 years down the road and say, oh my gosh, my cash on cash return on investment is incredible. But if you've amassed a ton of equity, what you really should be looking at then is your return on equity because you have a lot of equity in that property that might actually be producing a pretty small return compared to if you took some equity out of that property, you might be able to get a higher return elsewhere. So that's a little bit of a higher level concept that we can talk more about at a later time. Today, we're really focusing on this initial return on your investment. So I'm going to erase the board here and I'm going to put up two deals and we're going to compare them side by side. So here on the board, I now have all of the information that's needed for the two houses that we're going to compare. Now, I know this is a lot of information. I'll walk through it piece by piece. And obviously, I don't normally do this on a whiteboard. I normally do this all on the computer, and I will show that to you at the end of this episode. But it's not called Spreadsheet Wednesday, so we're going to walk through it here on the whiteboard. So house one is the house that we've been talking about for the last 5 weeks that we've done our entire underwriting process with. So as a reminder, The listed price was $175,000. 20% down would be $35,000, estimating about $2,500 in closing costs and about $8,000 in renovations. Holly and I would have had to bring $45,500 as our down payment, closing costs, and renovations to get this house in a state to rent. And as we've talked about through our underwriting, we thought we could have gotten $1,825 in rent. Combining the principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, those are our main expenses here. The tenant would have been responsible for all utilities. There wouldn't have been any other significant expenses for us. And then our reserves, which is roughly 15% of the rent that we're setting aside for vacancies, capital expenditures, and maintenance and repairs. So to create that reserve account, our monthly cash flow using these numbers comes out to be around $265 a month. So you multiply that by 12 and see that you get an annual cash flow of just over $3,000. Now, the other house that we were looking at around the same time was a lower price. It was only $125,000. It was a little bit smaller and in a little bit worse shape. The down payment on that would have only been $25,000, roughly the same closing costs, but we would have had to bring a lot more in renovations. So you can see our total amount invested actually would have been higher, although it's a lower price house because significant difference there in renovations. That house, because it was smaller, would have rented for a little bit less, so around $1,650. But the PITI also would have been less because it's a smaller mortgage, and our reserves would have been slightly less because it's a percentage of rent, and your rent is a little bit lower. This one, however, would cash flow about $464 a month or over $5,500 a year. So how do you compare these to know what's a better investment? This one gives you more cash flow, but you also have to bring more money to the table. You have a lower priced house. How do you weigh all of this? So the best way to do that is using that cash on cash return on investment equation that we talked about a few minutes ago. So you take your annual cash flow, you divide it by the total amount you invested. In this case, for house number one, the cash on cash return on investment is a 7.0%. For this house, you do the same thing. Take your annual cash flow, divide it by the total amount you invested. And in this case, the cash on cash return on investment is 10.6%. So you can see that on house number two, you would get 10.6% of the amount that you invested back in the first year in the cash flow. Now, again, it's not saying this is necessarily the house that you should be buying, but it is saying from a cash flow standpoint that it will provide a higher cash on cash return on investment. Now, you also need to think about other things like, is one of them in a better school district? Is it going to be more desirable? Is it going to get better tenants? Is it going to appreciate more? Is it going to be less work? There's a lot of things to think about. But in this case, these were in very similar neighborhoods, very similar school districts, not significant difference in the amount that they'll appreciate or any other difference in the amount of tenants that you'd be able to attract. So in this case, we actually originally put in an offer on this house. It went into a bidding war, went up over $190,000. At that point, we knew that we weren't going to be able to get a good return on investment. So we did not get house one. A couple weeks later, we put in an offer on house two, and we did end up buying house two. So I can go through numbers later about house two, but it is going to be one of our best cash flowing properties. It is for a very small house, doing very well. Actually, actual cash flow likely going to be up over $500 a month. So these were all of our kind of underwriting numbers. And as I said, I underwrite a little bit conservatively. Some of the taxes and insurance were a little bit lower than we budgeted for, and the rent's going to be a little bit higher. So this is the process of how you would compare two different houses, determine how much your total amount invested would be for both, determine using this whole underwriting process what you could expect your cash flow to be, and then determine which one is going to give you a higher cash on cash return on investment. So there's one more thing I want to show you before we end the episode, and that is the difference in what you could expect on your cash on cash return if you buy a house completely outright in cash versus if you buy a house with a mortgage. So let's reset the board, we'll look at that, and then we'll be done for the day. So this is the house that we ended up buying. Everything in the right column is the same, and this is how we ended up buying it. 80% loan to value, or essentially a mortgage where we put 20% down, and the bank had a mortgage for the other 80%. But this column is what the numbers would have been if we had bought the house in cash. So as you can see, purchase price would have been the same. Down payment would have been the entire price if you're paying cash. I've made the closing cost half as much because a lot of your closing costs are going towards your mortgage. So if you don't have a mortgage, closing costs will be less. Renovations would have been the same. So we would have had to bring a total of $151,000 in order to buy this house cash, close on it, and do the renovations. So roughly 3 times higher investment than if you're only paying 20% down. However, as you can see, same rent, the principal, interest, taxes, and insurance is much lower because you don't have a mortgage. So there is no principal and interest, just your property taxes and your insurance. And you would want to set aside the same amount for reserves. So your cash flow, if you bought the house in cash, would be over $1,000 a month, so over double what you get by having a mortgage. So your annual cash flow over $12,000 a year. So which option is better? We know that this side you get a 10.6% return on your investment. The cash on cash return on this side is 8.1%. So you actually get a lower cash on cash return. So even though your cash flow is higher, the amount that you invested is so much higher that your cash on cash return is actually lower buying this house outright in cash. So I'm not saying that one way is the right way or the wrong way. There are certain ways that are better for some people. Getting a mortgage brings in the concept of leverage. So leverage allows you to put less money down and buy more real estate, scale more quickly. We'll talk about leverage in a future episode. Leverage can be the greatest thing about investing in real estate, and it can be the worst thing about investing in real estate. It's what makes people incredibly wealthy and what makes people lose it all. So it's all about how you use leverage. But leverage is a very important tool in real estate. And I just wanted to show that by getting a mortgage, you even though your cash flow is lower, you probably are going to get a higher return on your investment because you can put less money down. So next week we can talk a little bit more about leverage. But just wanting to show how to calculate cash on cash return on investment and how you'd go about not just underwriting one property, but underwriting multiple properties and determining which one is the best investment to move forward with. So I hope you found this helpful. We'll do one more episode where we'll take a property and we'll go through all of the different ways that it makes money, not just the cash flow, but the appreciation and the tax savings and the loan pay down as well. And then we'll move on to a different series. So thanks for sticking with me today. Have a great week. See you next week on Whiteboard Wednesday.